So an image is worth 16 by 16 words.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to admit, as far as academic paper titles go, that's a serious flex.
Oh, it absolutely is. It's concise, it's provocative, and it basically tells the entire computer vision community, hey, you know that architecture you've all been ignoring? Yeah, it's about to eat your lunch.
Right. Welcome to today's deep dive, everyone. We are looking into a paper that really it completely shook up AI. Our mission today is to figure out how you can treat a photograph like a sentence of words, why this initially seemed like a terrible idea, and, well, the surprising role of massive scale in making it work.
Yeah, and to set the stage for you listening, when this paper came out of Google Research, the
Mhm.
lines in the sand were drawn pretty clearly. I mean, they were carved in stone. If you worked with text, if you were doing natural language processing, you used transformers.
Like BERT or GPT.
Exactly. But if you worked with images, you used convolutional neural networks, CNNs, period. No exceptions.
Right, and that dogma had been in place since, what, AlexNet in 2012?
Yeah, around then.
So if you were doing vision, you were stacking convolutions. ResNet was the absolute king. But this paper, the Vision Transformer paper, or VIT, proposed something that, on the surface, honestly sounds kind of lazy.
Lazy's a good word for it, actually.
Right. It just asked, what if we stop trying to build these highly specialized, vision-specific architectures? What if we literally just take a standard transformer like the exact same code running BERT and just force it to look at a picture?
And force really is the operative word there.
Yeah.
Because mechanically speaking, a transformer and an image they're not a natural fit at all. A transformer wants a sequence of tokens, right?
Yeah.
It wants a 1D string of data, like words in a sentence.
Yeah.
But an image is a 2D grid of pixels.
Mm-hmm.
So the paper's brilliance, and also the reason it struggled early on, really comes from how they bridged that gap without inventing any new vision-specific mechanics.
Let's dig into that square peg in a round hole problem, because my immediate thought, and I'm sure it's what you're thinking too, is why do we even need a workaround? A transformer uses self-attention to look at relationships between inputs. Why can't we just feed it the raw pixels, pixel 1 attends to pixel 2, and so on?
I mean, you could, theoretically. But you have to think about the math of self-attention. It's a mechanism that compares every single token to every other token. It's a quadratic operation.
Okay, so big O of n squared.
Exactly. So if you have a standard image, say 224 by 224 pixels, that is roughly 50,000 pixels.
And 50,000 squared is, well, it's a number I really don't want to try to calculate in my head right now, but it's massive.
It's roughly 2.5 billion.
Wow.
Yeah, 2.5 billion calculations just for the attention matrix in a single layer. It is completely computationally impossible for current hardware to handle that efficiently. Doing it pixel by pixel is totally off the table. They needed a way to drastically reduce the sequence length while keeping all the visual information intact.
Enter the 16 by 16 words from the title. This is the patch method.
Precisely. Instead of looking at individual pixels, they take the image and they chop it up into fixed-size square patches, usually 16 by 16 pixels.
Like taking a photograph and cutting it up into a puzzle grid.
That's a great way to picture it. If you take that same 224 by 224 image and chop it into a puzzle of 16 by 16 squares, you end up with exactly 196 patches.
And 196 is a sequence length that a transformer can handle while sleepwalking.
Easily. But here's the really important technical detail that often gets glossed over when people talk about this. They don't just flatten these patches into a long list of raw pixel values and send them in. That wouldn't work well. They pass each flattened patch through a learnable linear projection.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. Why does it need to be learnable?
Because raw pixel values are incredibly noisy, and they don't carry high-level semantic meaning on their own. This linear layer maps the flattened patch, which is just a vector of raw colors, into a latent vector space of a specific dimension. This is the embedding.
So it's translating the visual data.
Exactly. It translates the visual data into the language that the transformer is already built to understand. To the model, that projected patch is now mathematically identical to how a word embedding works in an NLP model.
Okay, so patch 1 becomes token 1, patch 2 becomes token 2, but this brings up a massive issue for me.
What could?
Well, if I take a picture of a face, right, I cut it into puzzle squares, and I flatten those squares into a single line, I've completely destroyed the 2D structure. A CNN scans across an image, so it inherently knows that the nose is below the eyes.
Yeah.
If you flatten this into a sequence, doesn't the model just lose the entire concept of up, down, left, and right?
You hit the nail on the head. That is the single biggest deficit of the standard transformer architecture in this context. This is what we call permutation invariant. If you took those patches and just completely shuffled them, the self-attention mechanism would process them the exact same way. It has absolutely no inherent notion of space or geometry.
Which seems like an absolute deal breaker for computer vision. I mean, spatial structure is everything in a photo.
It would be a deal breaker if they didn't manually inject that spatial information back into the data. And they do this using position embeddings. They add a learnable vector to each patch embedding that effectively allows the model to label them. It's like a tag that says, I am the top left patch, or I am the center patch.
But these aren't just hard-coded X and Y coordinates, right? They aren't telling it the exact pixel location.
No, and that is actually the most fascinating part. They are learnable parameters. The model has to figure out the best way to represent location during its own training process. We aren't giving it a strict grid. We're giving it the capacity to build a grid in its own mind, so to speak.
That's wild. Okay, I want to touch on one more architectural component before we get to the actual results of the paper. In BERT, there's this concept of a class token. It's a special token added to the very start of a sentence that kind of acts as a summary for the whole thing. Did they keep that for the vision model?
They did, yeah. They prepend a learnable embedding to the sequence of image patches, right at position 0. As the data flows through all the different transformer layers, this class token is constantly attending to all the other image patches, aggregating the information.
And at the very end, when the model finally has to say, hey, this is a picture of a goldfish, does it look at the whole sequence of patches to decide?
No, and this is key for how efficient it is. The final classification head, which is usually just a multi-layer perceptron, is attached exclusively to that single class token. The model is essentially forced to compress all the relevant visual information from every single patch into that one single vector to make its final prediction.
Okay, so we have the architecture down. We've got patches, we've got linear projections, position embeddings, and a class token. It is a pure transformer. Absolutely zero convolutions.
Zero.
Now, the authors take this thing, they train it on ImageNet, which is the standard benchmark dataset with about 1.3 million images, and, well, it flops.
Yeah, flop might be a little harsh, but it was definitely underwhelming. When they trained it on ImageNet 1K, the vision transformer, or VIT, actually performed worse than the standard ResNet.
Which, for a paper with a title claiming to revolutionize the entire field, is a pretty bad start. And I think this brings us to the central conflict of the whole paper, which is inductive bias.
Yes, this is the core theoretical argument of the paper,
Right.
and we really need to define inductive bias clearly for you listening. It refers to the set of assumptions about the data that we, the engineers, build into the model's design from the start.
Like baked-in rules.
Exactly. CNNs have very high inductive bias for images. We hard-coded two specific things into them, locality and translation equivariance.
Let's break those down. Locality is fairly obvious. Pixels that are physically next to each other are strongly related. A corner of an eye relates to the pupil next to it. Translation equivariance, though, what does that mean in simple terms?
It just means that a visual pattern recognized in one place is understood to be the exact same pattern if it appears somewhere else. If a CNN learns what an eye looks like in the top left corner of a photo, it automatically knows how to recognize an eye in the bottom right corner.
Because it uses the same sliding window of filters everywhere.
Exactly. It scans the whole image with the same filter.
That sounds like a superpower. Why would we ever want to get rid of that? It's basically free efficiency. We're telling the model, hey, the physical world works like this, so it doesn't have to waste time guessing.
It is a superpower, absolutely, especially when you don't have a lot of training data. It drastically restricts the search space of the model. The model doesn't have to spend time learning the basic concept that objects can move around in a frame. It's pre-programmed to know that. But, and this is the big, but inductive bias is also a restriction. It limits what the model is fundamentally capable of learning.
Because by hard-coding the rules, we're essentially putting a ceiling on its intelligence.
You got it. VIT has very low inductive bias. It doesn't assume locality. It doesn't assume translation equivariance. It treats every single patch as having a potential relationship with every other patch instantly. But because it starts with zero assumptions, it has to learn the basic rules of visual structure entirely from scratch.
And 1.3 million images simply wasn't enough data to teach it those rules.
Correct. On ImageNet 1K, the VIT model overfitted. It memorized the training data pretty well, but it couldn't generalize to new images because it hadn't yet figured out the underlying geometry of how the visual world works. The ResNet, with its inductive bias cheat codes, won easily.
So usually this is the point in a research project where a team would say, okay, our pure transformer idea didn't quite work, let's add some convolutions back in to help it along. But these authors did the exact opposite. They doubled down. They basically said the architecture isn't the problem. The problem is we just aren't feeding it enough data.
Enter the concept of scale.
Mm-hmm.
This is the massive turning point in the deep dive. They moved from ImageNet 1K to ImageNet 21K, which has 14 million images. And then they went even further, using Google's internal dataset called JFT300M, which has 303 million images.
300 million. That is a staggering amount of data.
It really is. And when they pre-trained VIT on that massive scale and then transferred it back to the smaller benchmark tasks, the entire graph flipped. The VIT model didn't just catch up to the CNNs, it completely surpassed the state-of-the-art ResNet, specifically the big transfer or BT models.
Do we have the exact numbers on that?
We do. On ImageNet, after massive pre-training, VIT reached 88.55% accuracy. On SciFar 100, it hit 94.55%. It also dominated across the VTT suite, which is a collection of 19 very diverse vision tasks.
So the takeaway here is kind of brutal but very simple. Inductive bias is just a crutch for when you don't have enough data.
That is the core finding, yes. The paper proves that if you just feed the model enough data, it learns the spatial relationships on its own. And it actually learns them better, or at least more flexibly, than we could ever manually program them. Scale trumps inductive bias.
Okay, but I have to play devil's advocate here for a second. We're replacing elegant human design engineering with pure brute force. We're just throwing hundreds of millions of images at a blank slate until it finally submits and learns the rules. Isn't that deeply inefficient? Aren't we just burning massive amounts of compute just to avoid using a convolution?
That is the very natural, intuitive assumption. You would definitely think a model that has to learn left and right from absolute scratch would be a computational nightmare. But the paper reveals something super counterintuitive. VIT is actually more compute efficient than the comparable CNNs.
Wait, how is that even possible? Transformers are famous for being incredibly heavy and resource intensive.
It mostly comes down to hardware optimization. The matrix multiplications inside a transformer are incredibly uniform and highly optimized for modern AI accelerators like TPUs and GPUs. Convolutions, on the other hand, have really complex memory access patterns. So at the massive scale, CNNs are actually slightly less efficient on the hardware.
And they measure this, right?
They did. To reach the state-of-the-art accuracy, the massive CNN, the BTL model, took significantly more compute than the massive VITH model. They measured the training cost in TPU-core-days.
Okay, what were the numbers?
The best CNN took about 12.3 thousand core days to train. The VIT took about 2.5 thousand.
Wow. 2.5 compared to 12.3. So it's not just a little bit faster, it's a fraction of the computational cost.
Exactly, for the exact same level of accuracy. It turns out that once you pay the upfront cost of massive pre-training, VIT is actually the cheaper option for high-performance computer vision. That finding basically killed the argument that transformers were too heavy to use for images.
Okay, so it works, it's efficient, it's state-of-the-art, but I'm still a bit stuck on the how. You mentioned earlier that it has to learn the grid from scratch. Did the authors actually prove that it learned this? Or is the model still just a black box where we hope it knows what it's doing?
They actually opened the black box, and the visualizations in this paper are arguably the coolest part of the whole study. They specifically looked at those position embeddings we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Remember, those vectors started as complete random noise.
Yeah.
So after the training was done, they calculated the mathematical similarity between the learned embedding for one patch and all the other patches in the image. And they found that the embedding for, say, row 1, column 1, was highly similar to row 1, column 2, and row 2, column 1.
So it literally reconstructed the coordinate system on its own.
Perfectly. It learned the row structure and the column structure simply by observing which patches tended to appear together in the massive data set. It reverse engineered the 2D topology of an image just from the high-dimensional correlations of raw pixel data.
That is just incredible. It's like learning the entire concept of a map just by reading enough driving directions.
That's a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And there's another visualization they did that really differentiates it from CNNs, which is attention distance. This essentially measures how far away in the image a specific pixel is looking to gather its information.
Right. And in a CNN, that's rigidly defined. Layer 1 only looks at a tiny 3x3 pixel area. Layer 2 looks slightly wider. It's a very slow zoom out process.
Exactly. A CNN must process information locally first. It has no choice. But when they analyzed the attention heads in the VIT model, they found something really weird. In the very first layer, some of the attention heads were indeed looking locally, focusing on their immediate neighbors. but other heads were attending to the entire image
Wait, in layer 1?
in layer 1. That means a pixel in the top left corner was effectively communicating with a pixel in the bottom right corner immediately. This is called a global receptive field, and it's something CNNs simply cannot do until you get very, very deep into their layers. VIT can integrate global context, the overall vibe of a whole image, right from the very start.
That explains why it works so well once it has enough data. It's seeing the forest and the trees simultaneously, whereas a CNN is stuck looking at the bark for the first 10 layers.
That's exactly right. It allows for a much more flexible and complex mixing of visual information.
Now, the paper does mention a hybrid approach. What was that all about? Were they
Yeah.
just hedging their bets in case the pure transformer didn't scale?
A little bit, yeah. They tested an architecture where they fed the feature maps from a standard ResNet into the transformer instead of just raw image patches. So the idea was, let the CNN handle the early local visual processing and let the transformer handle the high-level global reasoning.
Did it work?
It worked very well when they were operating on smaller compute budgets. The inductive bias of the CNN acts a bit like training wheels, helping the transformer learn faster when data is scarce.
But I'm guessing there's a catch based on everything we've talked about.
There is. The graphs in the paper show a very clear crossover point. As you scale up the size of the model and the size of the data set, the pure vision transformer eventually catches up and overtakes the hybrid. At massive scale, those training wheels actually start to slow you down.
It really seems like scale is the answer to every single question raised in this paper.
It really is. The bitter lesson of AI strikes again.
There's one final technical detail I want to hit before we wrap things up. Self-supervision. We know BERT changed the entire NLP landscape because it didn't need labeled data. It just learned by filling in blank words in a sentence. Did they try to do a vision BERT here?
They did touch on it. They tried an approach called mask patch prediction. They would take an image, hide a patch of it, and ask the model to guess the average color or structure of that missing piece.
And how did it do?
It was okay. It achieved about 79.9% accuracy on ImageNet, which, to be fair, is really impressive for a model that was never explicitly told what a dog or a car is, but it was still significantly behind the supervised baseline approach.
So it wasn't quite a slam dunk for self-supervision yet?
Not in this specific paper, no.
Yeah.
But it is very important to note that this exact experiment laid the groundwork for masked autoencoders, or MAE, which came out a couple of years later. MAE eventually solved this problem and proved that self-supervision absolutely works for images too. But at the time of this paper, it was mostly presented as a promising footnote for future work.
Got it. So zooming out and looking at the big picture, we have a paper that basically stood up and said, forget everything you thought you knew about computer vision architectures. Just take a language model, chop up the image, and feed it an ungodly amount of data.
And it worked. It really signaled the end of the era of architecture engineering, where researchers would spend years hand-designing clever spatial filters, and it fully confirmed the era of data engineering.
It's also a massive step toward unification in AI, isn't it?
That is the most profound implication here. Before this paper, we had distinct organs for AI. The eyes were CNNs. The ears and language centers were RNNs or transformers. This paper proved that the transformer is actually a universal computation engine. It processes patterns, regardless of whether those patterns represent words, pixels, audio waves, or even protein sequences.
One model to rule them all.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
It dramatically simplifies the entire field. You don't necessarily need an isolated vision team and an isolated NLP team anymore. You just need a really good transformer team and a massive data team.
But I want to leave everyone listening with a provocative thought, something we touched on earlier. We talked about inductive bias as a limitation. But another way to look at inductive bias is that it's expert human knowledge. By throwing it away, we are betting the farm that raw data and compute can completely replace human understanding.
We are. And in this specific case, the bet paid off flawlessly. But it does force us to ask a bigger question. What other expert rules are we clinging to right now? Think about robotics or physics simulations or drug discovery. We have all these incredibly complex, hand-designed architectures based on centuries of human understanding of those specific domains.
And we assume those designs are helping the AI.
We do. But this paper strongly suggests that if we can just figure out how to tokenize that domain data and scale it up massively, our so-called expert help might actually be the very bottleneck preventing the next breakthrough. We might be the ones holding the AI back.
A very humbling thought for all the experts out there. An image is worth 16 by 16 words, a bold title that actually delivered on its promise.
Absolutely. It changed the landscape.
Well, thanks for breaking this down with me today.
Always a pleasure.
And thank you for listening to this deep dive. Keep questioning the architecture, and we'll see you in the next one.